If the truth had come out that night, 3 innocent lives would have disappeared into history without anyone ever knowing they had existed. One exhausted soldier walked away from a report that should have taken less than 60 seconds to write. A young woman spent the entire night waiting for boots on the stairs, convinced every heartbeat was her last moment of freedom. Somewhere beneath an ordinary farmhouse, a single breath was held so quietly that it almost ceased to exist. Why would a disciplined American infantryman risk everything to protect someone he had been ordered to investigate? What could possibly be hidden beneath broken floorboards that mattered more than military protocol? And why, decades later, would he still refuse to tell anyone what he had seen? The answer was never written in an official record. It survived only in silence. The war in Europe was ending, but silence could still decide who lived and who disappeared forever. The village had surrendered without celebration, leaving behind empty streets, shattered windows, and doors that opened only after long hesitation. Staff Sergeant Daniel Carter had crossed enough ruined towns to recognize the same expression on every civilian face. People no longer feared artillery. They feared questions. His assignment was simple: inspect homes, document supplies, record anything unusual, and move to the next address before sunset. Routine had become its own form of survival. Near the edge of the village stood a narrow stone cottage whose roof had somehow escaped the worst of the fighting. Its garden was overgrown, yet someone had recently drawn water from the old hand pump. That tiny detail caught Daniel's attention before anything else. The woman who answered the door introduced herself as Anna Keller. She looked no older than 26, her blonde hair tied neatly behind her head, her pale hands steady despite the fatigue written across her face. She spoke careful English without inviting conversation. Every answer was precise, every movement restrained. Yet while she remained perfectly composed, her eyes drifted for the briefest instant toward the wooden staircase behind her. As though she were listening for a sound she prayed no one else would ever hear. Daniel did not answer her immediately. Instead, he removed his gloves one finger at a time and glanced around the small kitchen with the patient attention of a man who had learned that ordinary details often revealed extraordinary truths. The wood stove was still warm. 2 cups rested beside the sink, although only one appeared to have been used recently. A wool blanket hung over the back of a chair despite the mild spring afternoon. Nothing proved anything by itself. Together, they whispered that someone else might have been there only moments earlier. Anna noticed where his eyes paused. She folded her hands in front of her apron and forced herself to remain perfectly still. Outside, a breeze carried the distant sound of trucks rolling through the village square, followed by the laughter of soldiers finally allowed to believe the war was ending. Inside the cottage, every tiny sound seemed louder than it should have been. A floorboard settled somewhere above them with a soft creak. It lasted less than a second. Daniel heard it. So did Anna. Neither acknowledged it. He slowly opened his field notebook and uncapped his pencil. The blank inspection form waited for simple answers. Number of occupants, food supplies, livestock, unusual findings. He had completed dozens of identical reports during the previous month. Most required less than 5 minutes. This one suddenly felt impossibly heavy. Anna watched the pencil hover above the paper without touching it. She understood military procedure well enough to know that one honest sentence could bring more soldiers to her door before sunset. Daniel finally looked toward the staircase. The silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt crowded with everything neither of them dared to say. Then, without warning, another faint sound drifted from above. Not footsteps, not movement across the floor, just the careful exhale of someone trying very hard not to be heard. Daniel closed the notebook halfway. He had found exactly what regulations required him to investigate. Yet something in that frightened, deliberate silence refused to resemble the enemy he had expected to find. Daniel had spent nearly 4 years learning that fear often sounded the same in every language. It was not hidden in words. It lived in the pauses between them, in trembling hands that refused to shake, in eyes that measured every expression before answering a question. Anna carried that same fear with remarkable discipline, yet she never pleaded for mercy. She simply waited for whatever decision he would make. Daniel set his notebook on the kitchen table and walked toward the staircase. Each wooden step answered beneath his boots with a tired groan softened by years of use. Dust floated through narrow beams of afternoon sunlight that slipped between cracked shutters. At the top of the stairs, he found a small bedroom with neatly folded blankets, a wardrobe missing one door, and a single window overlooking the quiet village road. Nothing appeared unusual. Even so, the uneasy feeling remained. He stood perfectly still. Then he heard it again. Not above him this time, but below. A faint scrape beneath the floorboards near the far wall. He knelt and brushed away a thin layer of dust until the outline of a square wooden hatch became visible. It had been carefully disguised beneath an old rug and a small table holding a chipped ceramic lamp. Whoever had hidden it had expected someone observant enough to notice, but hopeful enough to walk away. Daniel slowly lifted the edge of the hatch just far enough to see darkness below. A pair of frightened blue eyes stared back at him. They belonged to a little girl no older than 8. She clutched a worn cloth rabbit against her chest and remained absolutely silent, as though silence itself had become the language of survival. For several long seconds, neither of them moved. Then another face appeared behind her, an elderly woman with silver hair and a faded Star of David sewn carefully inside the lining of her coat, instead of outside where anyone could see it. Daniel understood everything before a single word was spoken. The secret hidden beneath Anna's home had never been about protecting the past. It had always been about giving 2 forgotten lives the chance to reach tomorrow. Daniel lowered the wooden hatch with extraordinary care, making certain it settled into place without the slightest sound. He remained kneeling for another moment, his hand resting lightly on the worn floorboards, as if the simple gesture could reassure the frightened souls hidden beneath them. Then he rose, adjusted the rug exactly where he had found it, and walked back downstairs with the same measured pace he had used throughout the inspection. Anna stood where he had left her. She searched his face, trying to read a decision before he spoke. He reached for his notebook once more. The pencil hovered above the page, waiting for facts that would soon become part of an official military archive. Instead, he quietly wrote, "Residence inspected. 1 civilian occupant. No unusual findings." He closed the notebook before the ink had fully dried. Anna stared at the report in disbelief. She did not smile. Relief was too dangerous to celebrate. She simply released a breath she had been holding for what felt like months rather than minutes. Daniel slipped the notebook into his jacket and walked toward the front door. Just before opening it, he paused. Without turning around, he spoke in a calm voice that carried neither sympathy nor judgment. "Keep them hidden until it is safe. Do not trust rumors. Wait for official notices." Anna swallowed hard. "Thank you" was the only English phrase she managed before emotion stole the rest of her words. Daniel gave the smallest nod and stepped outside into the cool afternoon air. The village looked unchanged. Soldiers crossed the square carrying supply crates. Children watched cautiously from broken fences. An old church bell echoed across the rooftops for the first time in weeks. Everything appeared ordinary, yet nothing felt the same. As Daniel walked toward the next assignment, the folded report inside his jacket seemed heavier than any equipment he had carried during the war. For the first time since putting on an American uniform, he understood that loyalty was not always measured by the orders a soldier obeyed. Sometimes it was measured by the innocent lives he chose not to expose. The following morning arrived beneath a sky washed pale blue by overnight rain. Damp earth released the clean scent of spring as sunlight spread slowly across the village rooftops. Daniel reported to the temporary command post inside the former town hall, where stacks of handwritten inspection reports covered long wooden tables. Officers compared notes, marked supply inventories, and discussed families who might still require food or medical attention. Everything sounded routine until Lieutenant Harold Bennett stopped beside Daniel's desk with a thin folder tucked beneath his arm. "There is something unusual about one of yesterday's inspections," he said quietly. Daniel looked up without changing his expression. Bennett opened the folder and tapped a blank section on a neighboring patrol report. Another squad had questioned several villagers living near Anna's cottage. One elderly farmer claimed he occasionally noticed smoke rising from the chimney long after the house was supposed to be empty during daylight hours. Another woman insisted she had once heard what sounded like a child laughing inside, although everyone believed Anna lived completely alone. Bennett frowned, not with suspicion, but with professional curiosity. "Perhaps they are only frightened rumors," he said. "Still, I would like another inspection before we close the file. Daniel felt the weight of those simple words settle quietly across his shoulders. A second search conducted by someone less patient would uncover everything within minutes. He nodded slowly and accepted the assignment without argument. Refusing would only invite questions he could not answer. Outside, the morning breeze carried the distant ringing of bicycle bells and the voices of children cautiously returning to streets that had been silent for far too long. Life was beginning again, one careful step at a time. Yet Daniel understood that hidden beneath one ordinary cottage, hope remained balanced on the edge of a single decision. As he folded the new inspection order into his pocket, he realized protecting a secret once had been difficult enough. Protecting it twice might demand far more than silence. Daniel chose to walk back to the cottage alone. He told Lieutenant Bennett that a second inspection would move faster with fewer people inside the house, and the explanation sounded reasonable enough to avoid further discussion. The narrow road felt different from the day before. Every familiar landmark now carried invisible consequences. The old well beside the crossroads, the weathered fence surrounding a small orchard, the cracked stone wall where children had begun leaving wildflowers between loose bricks. Ordinary places suddenly seemed to be watching whether one man would remain faithful to a decision no official record could ever acknowledge. Anna opened the door before he reached the porch, as though she had been standing there listening for approaching footsteps all morning. She saw the folded inspection order in his hand and immediately understood. Her face remained calm, but the color quietly disappeared from it. Daniel stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "You do not have much time," he said softly. "Another officer believes someone may return if questions continue." The words settled over the room with painful certainty. Anna nodded once before disappearing upstairs. When she returned several moments later, she carried a small canvas bag filled with bread, dried apples, and a canteen of water. She never asked whether Daniel could protect them forever. She knew no honest person could make such a promise. Instead, she looked directly into his eyes and asked a different question. "Is there anywhere hope still exists?" Daniel remained silent for several seconds before answering. "There is a relief station nearly 12 miles west, operated by Allied medical volunteers. Families are beginning to gather there. It is not completely safe, but it is safer than remaining hidden here if another search takes place." Anna listened carefully, committing every detail to memory. Above them, the floor remained perfectly quiet. Beneath that silence waited two lives preparing once again to trust strangers because they had already run out of every other choice. Daniel realized that his secret was no longer simply about protecting them where they were. It had become about helping them find a future beyond fear. That evening, the village disappeared beneath a curtain of steady rain, the kind that softened footsteps and blurred distant shapes into shadows. Daniel had hoped the weather would delay any additional inspections, but hope rarely followed military schedules. Before sunset, a messenger arrived with unexpected news. Lieutenant Bennett had decided to accompany him after all. Several nearby homes would be checked together, making the route more efficient before the unit moved out the following morning. Daniel accepted the revised orders without hesitation, although every word tightened the quiet pressure already growing inside him. Less than an hour later, two American soldiers walked side by side toward Anna's cottage. Bennett spoke casually about supply records and transportation plans, unaware that each step carried them closer to a truth Daniel had already chosen to protect. Warm light glowed faintly behind the cottage windows. Anna saw both uniforms through the curtain and instantly understood that everything had changed. She neither panicked nor hesitated. She simply climbed the stairs one final time, knelt beside the hidden hatch, and whispered that it was time. The elderly woman squeezed the little girl's hand, and together they slipped through a narrow passage leading from the cellar toward an abandoned storage shed beyond the orchard, an old escape route built years earlier for storing potatoes during harsh winters. It was cramped, damp, and barely large enough to crawl through, but it offered one chance where none had existed before. By the time Daniel knocked on the front door, Anna was standing calmly in the kitchen with a kettle warming over the stove. Bennett stepped inside first, offering a polite apology for the inconvenience before beginning another careful inspection. Every room appeared exactly as expected. The bedroom remained tidy. The wardrobe stood open. The floorboards revealed nothing unusual. Daniel watched Bennett pause near the old rug for a brief moment before continuing toward the window instead. Outside, hidden beyond the rain and the orchard trees, two fragile lives moved slowly toward uncertainty, while only one man inside that quiet cottage understood how close they had come to being discovered once again. Lieutenant Bennett completed the inspection with the same quiet professionalism Daniel had always respected. He checked the pantry, examined the cellar entrance, looked through the small upstairs room once more, and finally closed his notebook with a thoughtful expression rather than a suspicious one. As the two soldiers prepared to leave, Bennett paused near the kitchen table where an old family photograph rested inside a cracked wooden frame. It showed Anna as a young girl standing beside her parents in front of the same cottage before the war had changed every familiar landscape. Bennett studied the picture for a moment before speaking softly. "It is difficult to imagine how much this place has endured," Anna answered with simple honesty. "Houses remember everything, even when people stop talking about it." Bennett nodded without replying. Outside, the rain had already begun to ease, leaving tiny drops clinging to the apple trees like scattered glass. The three of them stepped onto the porch together. Daniel believed the hardest part had finally passed until another military truck rolled slowly into the lane. A senior captain climbed out carrying a leather folder filled with revised occupation directives. He greeted Bennett briefly before explaining that headquarters had issued new instructions regarding displaced civilians and anyone found sheltering vulnerable survivors. The orders emphasized immediate protection, medical care, and transportation to designated Allied relief centers. The captain handed Bennett a signed copy before returning to his vehicle. Bennett read the document carefully from beginning to end. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. He folded the papers, slipped them into his coat, and looked back toward Anna's quiet cottage. Then he turned to Daniel with calm certainty. "Your original report was accurate after all," he said. "There are no military concerns here. Only civilians trying to survive what remains of the war." Daniel held his gaze without speaking. Bennett offered the slightest understanding smile, one so restrained it could easily have gone unnoticed by anyone else. At that moment, Daniel realized he had not been carrying the secret alone. Another good man had quietly chosen compassion over suspicion, and neither of them intended to record that decision anywhere except in memory. Years later, after uniforms had been folded away and battlefields had become quiet fields once again, Daniel Carter would sometimes wake before sunrise with the memory of that little cottage returning more clearly than any parade or medal ceremony. He could never remember the exact words written on hundreds of official reports, but he remembered the sound of one careful breath beneath hidden floorboards as though it had happened the day before. Some memories refused to fade because they had never belonged to history alone. They belonged to conscience. Not long after the occupation forces established permanent relief stations, Anna guided the elderly woman and the little girl safely to the medical volunteers Daniel had mentioned. Their names appeared on humanitarian records instead of casualty lists, and from that moment forward, they were finally allowed to exist without hiding. Daniel never visited them again. He believed some acts of kindness became smaller the moment someone asked for gratitude in return. Nearly 20 years passed before an unexpected envelope arrived at his home in Ohio. Inside was a single photograph. Anna stood beside the elderly woman, while the little girl, now a young schoolteacher, smiled beneath the branches of an apple tree growing outside a rebuilt house. On the back of the photograph, only one sentence had been written in careful English. "You protected strangers until they became a family again." Daniel placed the photograph inside the same worn notebook that had once carried the inspection report declaring there was nothing unusual inside a quiet village cottage. He never showed it to reporters, never mentioned it during veterans gatherings, and never added the story to his personal records. Some people believe courage was measured by the moments history remembered. Daniel had learned something different. The greatest decisions were often invisible because they left no monument behind. They survived only in lives that continued because someone quietly chose compassion when no one was watching. Anna never considered herself extraordinary. Daniel never considered himself a hero. Yet somewhere between one unwritten report and one protected secret, two ordinary people proved that dignity does not need applause to change the course of another human life. She never raised her voice. She raised the standard.